Welcome to the APAC Japan Program book launch event for Dr. Michael Beeman's book, Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia Pacific and Beyond. My name is Kyoteru Tsutsui. I'm the director of the Japan Program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this book launch event. I will introduce Dr. Beeman very briefly, and we'll dive into his presentation. Dr. Beeman, he has a degree from SMU. We were talking about how SMU football program fell apart in his senior year. And he went to Johns Hopkins for his master's, and then he got a PhD from Oxford studying Japan's economy and trade. And then he went and applied his knowledge and deep expertise to the practice of trade, working at USTR, US Trade Representative Office for years, for decades, working under the George W. Bush administration, Obama, Trump, as well as Biden administration. So he's seen the end of TPP. He left office for a little while and then came back to see the Obama administration terminate the TPP. Well, that's probably not accurate, but anyway. So he saw the end of TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and also saw the beginning of the emergence of the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So he's a deeply experienced, and in addition to that, he led negotiations for free trade agreements with Korea, South Korea, Japan, and so on. So he's a very highly experienced trade representative, and we've been fortunate to have him as a visiting scholar here at APAC for the last couple of years. And he was focused on completing this book, which he did. And just so you know, we have, please take a look at or pick up this paper because it has a discount code for his book. So if you find it interesting, you get a 30% discount using this code. But without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Beeman for his book launch.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Kyo. Thanks, everyone, for taking your time out of your busy day. Hope the lunch is a good incentive for you. Kyo's correct. I worked in the U.S. Trade Office for many years. I actually left for a couple of years, came back at the very, very end of the Obama administration. And as I was just telling Kyo, I actually was the one asked to deliver the TPP withdrawal letter to Japan. That was one of my first positions back, or first task back after rejoining USTR. But thank you for the warm introduction. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about this book, this first of several book talks I have scheduled, and my first ever book launch. I have a somewhat dynamic presentation, so we're going to try. It's going to test me and test my patience to be able to keep up with it. But hopefully, it will make it more entertaining and interesting for you to watch and to listen. So this project, of course, became my book, which Kyo just introduced, Walking Out. I am most fortunate to be a visiting scholar here at APARC. I'm deeply grateful to Kyo, to you, to Giwook, and so many other faces in this room for really being so supportive and so helpful. You provided me the opportunity to research, work, and write this book, have it published, teach a course on global trade politics here at Stanford, and to learn and contribute in many other ways. I also wish to thank George Kompacki, who is the book's copy editor. As everyone knows, you need a really good copy editor, and George was fantastic, and for his real tireless work and dedication to this project. Kyo mentioned, and as I just said, I'm a former US trade official. I worked in the US Trade Office for over 16 years. The last 6 was responsible for Japan, Korea, and APEC. I think many of you in this room, probably pretty well up-to-date, sophisticated crowd, have heard of USTR, but it's a pretty unknown agency to most Americans, of course. It's a very special, very small agency responsible for trade policy in the US executive branch. It was an awesome privilege and opportunity to work there for me. I loved it deeply, but it also was pretty stressful at times, to be clear. And so I also still oftentimes identify as this, a recovering former federal government bureaucrat. My last day at USTR and in the government was January 4th of last year. This is a true story. The next morning at daybreak, January 5th, I got in a car and I drove as far away from Washington as I possibly could, arriving here at APARC about a week later. That feeling of escape felt very right as I left Washington, left the DC metro area, and just even before I reached the foothills of the Shenandoah Mountains, I quickly knew it was the right decision for me to leave government and to pursue this. Probably it's the top goal actually I've had after leaving was to write this book. Not much of what's actually happening on US trade policy is really well understood, I think, generally. And I wanted to explain it, what's going on and why it's changing in the way it's changing. So my goal today is to help you understand it in a 30-minute book talk. So let's get moving. And let's start with a pivot to a bit of history. I'll start with this statement. America led the global trading order for 75 years. Here, I'm talking about the system of open and rules-based trade that predominated after World War II. This is the GATT and the WTO system, which most of you, I think, have some familiarity with. But I also mean to kind of include a larger array of values, principles, rules, and norms that this system has created in other trade arrangements around the world. So this US leadership wasn't always appreciated, nor was it always rock solid. Others also led and contributed, of course, to the system. And as was the case with other nations, America's own commitment to this system also wavered at times. There was zigging and zagging, in other words, over the years. But by and large, the United States kept trying to build further on the system, adding to it in new ways and in different ways, instead of substantially detracting or deviating from it to deal with new challenges. Staying in this lane for over 7 decades meant keeping zigs and zags to a minimum. It also took a pretty extraordinary political commitment to avoid swerving over the center stripe in the road and into the other lane. It's a commitment that US presidents and political leaders from both parties really maintained up to 2017. If we go back, however, 75 years and talk about why this system came into being in the first place, why the US became committed to it, Franklin Roosevelt's vision really stands very tall. This vision is now under pressure at times and under attack from both progressive left and the new right. They have taken over their parties on trade, taken the wheel, and actually swerved this vehicle into the other lane now. And the consequences for the Asia Pacific and for the United States and for others are pretty deep. And that is the focus of my book. Roosevelt's top priority, of course, was to pull America out of the Great Depression. He believed deeply that this required fundamental changes to US tariff policy. His earliest priority was to achieve the open, or let's say more open, part of the rules-based system. Here he is, FDR, in 1932, campaigning on the stump, talking about the issue of tariffs. He says, we must consent to the reduction, to some extent, of some of our duties in order to secure a lowering of foreign tariff walls. It's not a free trade embrace. Because on the campaign trail, tariffs are very high, very controversial. But what he's saying is this: the high tariffs the US has imposed on other nations in the 30s in the 20s into the 30s, and before that, had been responded to by other nations which imposed tariffs on the United States. These tariffs were justified to stimulate domestic production. Does that sound familiar? In fact, it had also cut off avenues for US agricultural exports for farmers to export their excess production. They didn't have anywhere to go. And for US industrial products that had been stuck behind the border, not able to find foreign markets, basically. So after the war, America emerged as a leader of the world and as a top promoter and facilitator of this type of system. Here we have, here we go. So after the world, so Roosevelt got busy and started to try and lower tariffs, but it was also coming a little bit too late, because the world was already beginning to slide into World War II, and the need for a vision of a new trading order essentially needed to be created. So he joined together with Winston Churchill in 1941, just before the United States entered the war, to call for this, to commit to this, basically, to commit to a vision for a post-war trading order, an endeavor to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, of access on equal terms, and I want to focus on that for a second, to the trade and the raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. So the equal terms is the rules-based part. This is the non-discrimination component. Here he is calling in 1941 for the need for this to also be a part of this order. And so Roosevelt was, multitasking here, but these are kind of the two components of the post-war trading order that the United States called for and promoted and managed to successfully advance the concepts of open trade and equal and non-discriminatory treatment. So this was actually the last person in the White House to honor that principle or those principles. So what happened and what's going on? I think you can guess from the title of my book that I argue that the United States, of course, has been walking out on trade. America's two political parties, including their leaders in the White House and on Capitol Hill, have decided to turn away from this system and go in the other direction. It could be enacting subsidies. It could be the discriminate against imports. It could be slapping tariffs on foreign trading partners of 10, 20, 60, 100, 200%. All those numbers have been thrown around recently. It's all starting to feel a lot like the 1920s and the 1930s again. This is the reason I dove into history just now, because I think it's a history that we thought we had perhaps learned from, but it seems like maybe we have not. The US support and leadership of the system instead has crumbled, and the new US approach has emerged in its place. This approach has been enabled by this new alignment in certain views between the progressive left and the new right, principally. They align in the view that open, rules-based, non-discriminatory trade has been a greater source of harm than of opportunity for America. And so with that, the US, as the architect and leader of the global trading system, is effectively walking out on its own vision, its own system, its own rules, its own principles, those that it supported, nurtured, and demanded of others for 75 years. Let me explain, be a little more clear what I mean exactly by walking out. Walking out is different things, right? One thing that it is oftentimes is a protest of some sort. In trade negotiations, this is often spontaneous. When a negotiator ends a meeting or heads for the door to object to some crazy, outrageous demand or condition set by a trading partner. I've done this once. It felt right at the time. I won't mention countries, but I've not worked on many countries, so you can guess probably who it was. More often, it's a tactic. It's a tactic used basically to object to something that is, in order to attempt to change the conversation, to refuse to accept some unacceptable condition or situation or offer or rule or proposal that one side just refuses to live with and can't accept. So the tactic, of course, is a negotiating tactic, and it is to withdraw until that condition or situation is changed or met. So it's not just me saying this, that the United States is walking out. Take the words of US political leaders since 2017. I think you'll recognize some of these words. Let's start with renegotiate, withdraw, terminate. I think you can all guess whose words those are on multiple occasions. But the Biden administration also has been talking in the same language, a softer version of it, but with similar intent. For example, the Biden administration officials will talk about things like that the current trading system, the rules-based global trading system the US promoted, is part of the problem, basically. They will also argue that it's time to write a new story on trade. This is the same thing in one way or another. It is walking out, essentially. It is rejecting something about the prior system or prior conditions, that the US insists has to be changed in order to go its new direction. But instead of trying to make it right by the rules, it just keeps discriminating and walking out. As it does so, the United States has been leaving things broken in its path. And this really effectively is where walking out becomes kind of a different thing, and it becomes this. I'll let it come up in a second, which is walking away. On what is America walking out and now walking away from? Don't get me wrong, there are things such as a bad trade deal. Not all trade deals are great. There are good reasons sometimes to walk out or walk away from certain situations or conditions or negotiations. And that's really not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is something much more systematic, much deeper, I would say, much more sweeping in its policy implications, reversals, and impacts. Let me explain. This slide is going to get a little complicated, but because of the way I try to present it, hopefully it will help. And that is on what is America walking out. This is going to be more of a kind of a before and after picture, and I'm going to try and fade in and fade out to help you understand what the difference is. I'm not here to teach a class on trade law or trade politics, but the WTO is really set up with three primary functions. The core principle of the WTO, non-discrimination. I mean, this is Roosevelt's equal terms, right? This is very much embedded in the system and in the rules. And it means two things. It means equal treatment among WTO members, and it means equal treatment between domestic products and foreign products, basically. So those are the two basic fundamental concepts. Also set up in the system is a dispute settlement mechanism to prevent these tit-for-tat tariff wars that go on if there's not a satisfactory resolution of a problem. WTO also was set up with trade liberalization negotiations. So it's struggled with that. It's had difficulty maintaining trajectory in this way, but as of 10 years ago, there were two active negotiations going on environmental good liberalization and on services liberalization. So this is kind of the traditional agenda the US has pursued for decades. There are also rules negotiations in the WTO. So these are oftentimes to make trade fair or more just in some way. So this was to restrict fish subsidies. This is a negotiation that was going on. So this is the picture, again, of about 10 years ago. So the US also had an agenda of bilateral and regional free trade agreements at the time, focused on TPP, of course, focused on a US-EU FTA agreement as well. The US also had a pretty entrenched, pretty routine system of tariff preferences for developing countries to enable them to benefit from trade more. So the US provided tariff-free access for developing countries and limited products, limited amounts, to be fair, but also basically things that were not made in the United States and were seen as an opportunity for developing countries to use trade to help develop and grow their economies. So this is the before picture. As I mentioned, now we have a very different picture, which is really kind of morphed into this, basically. Here we go. Oops, sorry. This picture is one more of taking away the non-discrimination and the recognition of the non-discrimination principle and turning it into something altogether different. Here we go. So it's basically turning non-discrimination into discrimination. Discriminating among members, so setting different tariffs, new tariffs for different countries for different reasons. Some of them are justified, some of them are, I think, not, at least under the rules anyway. Discriminating between foreign and domestic goods in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and preferences for US EV batteries, EVs, and others are a perfect example of that. The United States also broke the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. I won't go into why and how that happened, but it pretty much wiped it off the map in terms of being a functioning system and kind of left it up to itself to kind of decide what was right and what was wrong. The United States also, in the last 10 years, has completely wiped out global and this kind of large-scale WTO trade liberalization negotiations. So that's gone. The Trump administration did begin to pursue some additional rules negotiations in the multilateral context. But after the Biden administration came in, they didn't like those, and generally has had a difficult time agreeing on them or being a part of them. So I just took them off. Obviously, the traditional bilateral free trade agreements have been removed from the agenda. Instead, what you got in the Trump administration were renegotiated agreements, fixing the past, going back and changing the conditions. US, Mexico, Canada, or NAFTA, US, Korea, US, Japan, the last two were mine to deal with. Japan, in the case, it was really kind of a trying to get some of TPP back that it had walked out on. The Trump administration also did begin to pursue other free trade agreements, kind of with a new emphasis and focus with the UK and Kenya. But then the Biden administration came in, one had nothing to do with tariff liberalization whatsoever. So changed those into what I call deconstructed trade agreements, kind of very picky and choosy issues and more cooperation. Still with the UK and Kenya, adding Taiwan. IPEF is also one of these kinds of agreements as well. None of them have come to fruition as of this date. And then, sorry to say, developing countries have not fared well either. Congress has been unable to, has to periodically approve these tariff preferences programs, but it's been unable to do that for 3 years straight in a row. It has another program with Africa in this vein that it may or may not reapprove next year. So for now, it's really not showing much promise, so I'm just going to take that off. So now we have a before and after picture. This is US trade policy today. So very drastically different and so I hope I've convinced you that something has fundamentally changed here. And I'm happy to talk about any of these specific cases as well in the Q&A, of course. So why is America walking out? I think that's the question maybe that piqued your interest and brought you here, trying to understand, exactly what's going on. Most, I think, say or presume that it's all due to the emergence of China, right? That it's the China challenge and the rise of great power competition. Here we have China. I had to make the American flag a little bit bigger because China's on the screen, right? Just kidding, it's a joke. I wish that it were as simple as China, because that would be a much more simple problem to resolve if you think this is a problem. In fact, there's a lot of other reasons and that the US has used justifications to walk out on other commitments, to do something different, to renegotiate conditions, or to do something completely off script, basically. So it could be economic security and resilience. You remember steel and aluminum tariffs. That was justified in that vein, for example. The environment, it's way down here at the bottom. Whether or not there's huge disagreement, obviously in the US over the importance of this issue, but what both the left and the right do agree on is if the US government is gonna spend money on this, it's gonna discriminate against imports, and it's gonna go to US vendors, basically. The trade deficit. This, of course, is a Trump thing, everyone knows that, but it's actually been very, very, very strongly argued by labor unions, many progressive think tanks, and others for decades as a sign, a symbol of job killing, basically trade agreements. So it really is shared on both sides. Policy space, what is that? It's essentially used as a reason for progressive left to subtly and more explicitly reject the non-discrimination principles, the idea the US needs more space and may have to, I argue, discriminate, basically, as it wishes to achieve certain objectives. Globalization is another. This, of course, means rejecting open trade, generally. We have big tech, for example, which is basically fighting the idea that big tech should benefit from any trade agreements or any trade rules or any trade outcomes, regardless of the intent and regardless of whether small companies could benefit as well. We have labor union rights as also being used to justify rejecting or changing trade agreements, basically to turn any agreement into a full labor rights commitment agreement. And if it doesn't satisfy labor unions, then they will oppose all of it, basically. The last justification I'll put up is sovereignty. The new right and progressive left both welcome severing US accountability to the rules to kind of do as they wish. So all these look kind of scattershot, but there is a pattern. And I've just put the line down to describe this pattern. The top reasons and justifications are all foreign in their dimension, be it China, sovereignty, trade deficit. There's some foreign, it's really this, it's us versus them. It's the sense that the US is worse off for whatever reason because of how foreign actors are able to take advantage of the trading system. Also, by foreign, here I'll include multinational corporations as globalized entities, basically. So offshoring, sending jobs abroad, whatever it is, basically treated and seen more or less as them, essentially, as foreign countries. The bottom group, however, reflects a different kind of dynamic. It is in the domestic space. This is where you have what I call us versus us disagreements. These are primarily domestic disputes that are being litigated and fought over around the status quo that are then pulled into the trade space because they relate to trade rules, they relate to certain trade principles, they relate to certain trade commitments, and they get imploded in the process, basically. So this is a proxy battle taking place down here. So you have us versus them, where there's an alignment of view on the right and the left about a problem. You have domestic us versus us, where there is vast divergence and fighting and infighting and flip-flopping. So I'll come back to this in a second, explain a little bit more. But this is the pattern, and these are all the justifications, and there are more that the US has used over the last several years. I don't think we can, some people may disagree with this statement, but I think it is safe to say America is exceptional as long as you add the condition in the nature of its political divide. And here's the fundamental argument. Extreme polarization, political polarization has pulled America apart in many ways. I think we all know this, we all understand it, don't agree with it or are disappointed by it, but it is something which is being observed quite frequently and regularly. But there's an interesting phenomenon at work when it comes to trade policy, and it really comes in this foreign and domestic dimension. So I think this will help kind of characterize what this does to a trade, a rules-based trading order, basically. So let's start with polarization and what it is. Polarization is this. Let's see. So polarization, essentially, what it does is to drive zero-sum beliefs and assumptions among the different actors in a political system. That is rooted in the conviction that the gains from one come at the cost of others or self. It feeds into populism in many respects because it divides groups into the pure group or pure people and then the corrupt group or the corrupt elite, basically. Then it also feeds into nationalism. In the area of trade in particular, this manifests itself in a particular way in the desire to reassert sovereignty. On the other side of the ledger, we have the rules-based trading system, which is premised on a very different set of goals and objectives. It presumes and assumes positive sum outcomes. It's the idea that the rising tide will lift all boats, basically. It aims to provide stability and predictability to the trading system and to the economy. The only sort of major division between groups in this system is between how to balance trade obligations and trade commitments among developing and developed economies. It also aims to facilitate peace and avoid escalating tensions. And obviously, the whole point of it is to negotiate commitments, which means ceding a certain degree of sovereignty to the extent that you are concerned about that, but with the benefit of being able to benefit from all these other parts of the system, basically. So I think it's easier to see now maybe what forces have been at work that are pulling apart and sinking this bipartisan consensus on trade that the US had for 70 years. So I kind of made this a double vision effect because it wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfectly aligned, but basically it was close enough and it worked. And today though, however, both ends of this trade policy continuum have been bent so far back. They've kind of been bent around basically to meet each other on the backside. And this is where they've met in this new policy dimension that I've described. It's a gathering place for those who have soured on this prior system. It took the rise of extraordinary political polarization in the elections of 2016, 2020, and this election to continue to sink this consensus. It's a place where this policy alignment is forged and is trying to find new ways in one way, which is to wall off America from the world. Supplemented by sharp disagreements over the status quo at home, then there's no vision for what to do next, because they're also conflicting in the domestic space. So let me just briefly go through this just to kind of recap these main points. We have foreign countries and multinationals as them, basically. And then we have the kind of justifications for changing the rules or changing the terms, the idea that gains from trade are zero sum, the focus on results versus principles, harm versus opportunity, the sense that there may be a new center that is developed on the backside of this continuum, and you get walking out and walling off, basically. And this is where there is alignment in this new US trade policy. On the domestic side, you have the new right and the progressive left, principally as the protagonists here, of fighting each other. Interesting that the labor unions bounce back and forth quite a lot, and they play a hugely influential role in those arguments. So what you get from that are proxy fights over domestic issues that are actually changing trade rules. You get fights over the status quo in some way. You get refusal to live under the other's rules, right? They're both fighting over domestic issues. And you get controversy entrepreneurs, people who are ready to really use these tensions and these divisions to stoke more tension and division, basically. So what you're left with here is, in this dimension, flip-flopping. You get different administrations with different approaches and fighting over different rules at home that are reflected in the trading system. And you get walking out in a different sort of way. So let me just briefly highlight a couple of quotes that I use in my book to kind of describe this. The first one is this us versus them. This is my former boss, Robert Lighthizer, the title of his book, No Trade is Free. I think if you really understand what this means, what he's saying here, it sounds logical maybe to some, but for me, what it means is what he's saying is that open trade is a greater source of harm than opportunity. That's really what the title of this book is, and it's really kind of his whole thesis and whole point of writing the book, that the trading system has ripped America off and whatever that is, essentially. So that's pretty much where you get this alignment in the right and the left. On the other side, you get this conflict. One quote that I like to refer to is this one, which makes it pretty simple and clear for everyone. This is a quote from the former head of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka. This came in the midst of the update of the NAFTA agreement, and labor unions insisted that it wasn't enough, and the Trump administration had to go back and get more, basically. So what he argues is the deal before us today tries to serve two masters, the corporate interests and the workers. But here's the thing, you can't serve both, right? It's one or the other. This is this zero sum in the domestic dimension. So here we are. So I'm gonna leave that up for a second because I'm gonna explain. This is really the mire or the muck, if you prefer, that US trade policy is in today. And that is if you believe it's gone off course. If you think this is all in your favor, that this is the direction you've been wanting, then you're in nirvana, basically, because US trade policy has pretty much arrived at that point. Trump withdrew from the TPP, but that didn't happen out of nowhere. TPP had a target on its back from the new right. And actually, one of the interesting things I found in researching my book was looking at polling of the Tea Party members. You may remember the Tea Party back in around 2010. It was really where the new right sort of, came out of the woodwork and became a political movement. And those polls in 2010 showed that about 62% or 63% of Tea Party adherents at the time, which is a very loose group at the time, didn't have Trump as a spokesperson or anything, believed that free trade agreements were bad for America. That was almost identical to the number of labor union members and labor union households that agreed that trade agreements were bad for America. So we have this very sharp opposition coming from the left and from the right toward trade at the same time. So TPP withdrawal didn't come out of nowhere. I describe this a lot in my book and kind of how I got to that point. It's also why the US has ended up in renegotiations instead of negotiations with Canada, Mexico, Korea, Japan. It's also why the US hasn't, when it's tried to negotiate agreements, hasn't been able to complete them, like IPEF, for example. It's also why the United States has really not been able to do much on trade for quite a while, besides letting trade preferences expire for developing countries, flip-flopping in its positions, literally putting proposals on the table and then a year later pulling them off the table. So you get the idea, and that's why I left this up here. So for those that are dispirited or concerned or disappointed by this, I figured it was probably helpful to leave some negative space up on the screen so you could just stare straight into it, because that's kind of what the picture looks like right now, basically. But let me pull you out of this and also make one point. My descriptions of the post-war trading system, it was such a wonderful, beautiful system and everyone got along, it was all peaceful, is a little, let's argue, Pollyanna, right? It wasn't always like that, I agree. It was pretty messy and pretty difficult to maintain. Trade has always been and will always be highly political and highly competitive among nations. And at times, it needs to be a contact sport. But we also have this situation now. And I agree, the US needs a muscular trade policy. China, for example, is a huge problem in certain ways for the United States and for other nations that, I think we probably do need to go off script sometimes. So I don't reject the idea of going off script from time to time, but having a muscular trade policy doesn't mean that all the time either. It also means really having some predictable rules to insist on that others abide by and that you have to abide by yourself. It's the frame on which this kind of policy has to be built and maintained. But the US now has so many reasons for going off script, and now the US can't even agree with itself on its own new vision for trade, other than walling off itself from the world. So with that, this post-war order, post-war consensus has faded. New justifications have emerged in its place. So I really try and focus on another issue in the book, which is revisionism that is seeped into the system in order to justify these changes in policies and change in trajectories in US policy that has really been used to effectively try and recast the purpose and the vision and the ideals that the system was built on. So I do this by going through a number of historical examples in the book as well, briefly, to try and underscore where these ideas came from and why the US was doing what it did before it went off track, basically. I give that one a flag. I think that needs a flag. So to summarize, America's new trade policy is this. It is often grounded in zero-sum assumptions, which is opposite of the trading system's ideals, fueled by exceptional political division. It rejects the status quo, and this is where you get alignment between the right and the left when it comes to foreign countries and foreign trade or multinationals. It also rejects the US status quo. All these fights going on in the domestic space between the right and the left that make it impossible to forge a new vision for trade, basically, other than just the discrimination part, basically. And then shadows of the 20s and 30s are very much present. I think the Wall Street Journal had an article today that made exact front headline article that made exactly the same point. So if that's not depressing enough, let me move to this, some implications. This is America's new normal. This is the trajectory that the United States is on. It is very hard to get off this trajectory once you're on it. It's been on it for 8 years. Obviously, what happens in the election is going to make a huge amount of difference on how fast it moves in this direction, and how sharp and how aggressive, but it's still going in the same direction. It's very difficult to unwind once it gets started, and there's little consensus on a new vision from the United States. The US will continue to be a drag on the WTO and the international system. The US is not the only one that's a drag on this system, trust me. But I also make a very specific point of adding a paragraph in the conclusion about how the US is looking a lot more like India. And if you know anything about India and trade, you know that this is the most, what's the word? Sort of, well, from the perspective of the old system, most backward looking sort of approach to trade that you could possibly come up with. So I think the US is in this zone. This is really important for you foreign policy and international relations people. It drives me a little insane when I hear from Washington talk about the need for the US the world to obey the international rules-based order, right? Because in trade, the US isn't doing that. And what you get with discrimination, what you get are a thicket of foreign relations issues and choices. So subsidies, are you going to give subsidies to some countries and not other countries, and who are you going to give them to, and is it going to be under certain conditions? Additional tariffs, who's going to get hit with the tariff? Who's not going to get hit with the tariff? Who's going to get the deal? Who's going to get the quota? Who's going to get, an exception or a tariff-free quota instead of an actual hard quota, for example? You get decisions around conditions for tariff preferences for developing nations. So, all right, you're a developing nation, you want to trade, you want to send your products to the United States tariff-free, but we're going to add all these additional conditions, and I'm sorry if it's basically impossible for you to meet them. You also get decisions around flip-flopping priorities, right? So you get trading partners who are negotiating with the United States, and then within a few weeks or months later, they have a completely different set of priorities from the United States. Maybe they pulled their proposals off the table or decided to not do the deal or whatever it is, basically. So this is a huge issue in terms of America's international relations and the future of international relations with Asia Pacific and outside of the Asia Pacific, which is, I think, highly underappreciated because this really chips and eats away at this sort of goodwill that countries try and create between nations. And then finally, you get what I call is, sort of mirroring, if you will, or copycatting, essentially, with other countries having a hard time justifying to their own populations why they're not doing this as well, right? As soon as the United States is doing it, well, we should be doing it too. Or maybe they see that is a good political choice to make at the time. So you get this kind of effect as well. So these are just some of the implications, I think. So let me end with this, basically, which is maybe perhaps the least optimistic of all. So if you believe that America should find its way out of this corner that it's found itself in, maybe really the right question is really not will America find its way out, but can it find its way out, I think is the real question. For critics of the trading system that US used to subscribe to, they have successfully pulled it into this mire, into this muck, basically. And that's why they want to keep it. It's working for them. For those who want to see change, however, improvement to go back, I think going back, snapping back is not what you're going to see, but at least finding its way back in some fashion. Then I think the answer to that question will really depend a lot on what happens in November. The trajectory is set, though, as I mentioned before, still the same, but intensity and direction will be different depending on which candidate is elected. And how to deal with the impacts of these decisions in the next administration could therefore be sharply different. So it's a little hard to say can or how or will until we see what it's going to be, because I think those are very different kind of problems, but it's still the same problem. Some bright spots, however, trying to be optimistic, right? US public opinion is mixed still on trade, but generally leans favorable toward trade still. There's not been a real collapse of US public opinion about trade. About high 50s into the 60% range usually is a typical answer you get from polls that ask Americans, do you support trade? Do you think trade is good for the economy? Those kinds of things. Not all polls, but most polls. So that's, I think, a positive light. It also reflects this kind of being pulled into this political polarization camp and not necessarily reflecting kind of what Americans have many concerns about trade, but not necessarily reflecting the general feeling about trade. So another bright spot may be a growing recognition that the need for resilience, right? We hear all this about the need for resilience and supply chain security and reliable trading partners. That could be a pathway back into limited agreements with countries that may liberalize tariffs. The idea that we have a, sort of there's a need for this kind of interconnection, and that by lowering tariffs or agreeing on certain rules may help facilitate that. And it could be in the US long interest to do that. So maybe we'll get to something like that, basically. But the other possibility is that we may just have to run into the wall first. We may have to have a major crisis that forces the US back, swerves back into the lane the US had been into in the 1940s, which means learning the hard way. So much will happen in November that will, I think, decide how likely any of these scenarios are. I'm not completely pessimistic, but it is a long slog back. And really, it's Americans themselves and it's the Americans' polarization that is standing in the way of, I think, finding its way back. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the very interactive presentation. I will take questions, but I just want to pose one question before we go to the audience, since we have more than about 40 minutes. I want to push you on the China factor a little bit more, because you lay a lot of emphasis on US domestic polarization as a cause for America's new normal in trade policy. But I'm wondering if you might be underplaying China a little bit. And when you put up the Godzilla versus Bambi picture, that was very intriguing to me, because Godzilla is a Japanese character, Bambi is a US character. But I'm just looking at the history of trade relations between Japan and
European, maybe actually.
Okay, it's a
Disney, definitely.
So Japan was right. I mean, you know very well. Japan is a very major trade threat to U.S. Foreign trade policy in the 70s, 80s, and when Japan was facing the United States in that period, being pressured to open the market. And all the way up to when Obama was pressuring Japan to join TPP, and then Trump turning away. It's like Godzilla, like just throwing everything and then turning away. And then Biden's a more softer version of Godzilla, but came to pressure Japan to do something for IPEF. All of these times, I think it looked like, from Japanese point of view, it already looked like US is a muscular player, trade partner, playing the Godzilla role. Now, China is not Bambi, right? Mm-hmm. So this new trade threat, is not Bambi, but it's more like a King Kong. It's a Godzilla versus King Kong that we're kind of seeing, right? So, and because Japan was really under control by the U.S., not in trade relations, and Japan was not that quick to open its market, for sure, but U.S. still had security of Japan under its control. So that was a huge advantage. Well, China doesn't fit the bill. So China is a different kind of threat. So how much does it factor into U.S.'s policy of walking out? Because now U.S. might have a different calculation in trade negotiations.
Yeah, let me start with China, then I'll go back to a couple of things you said, just to clarify a couple of things. I mean, as I mentioned in the presentation, without a doubt, China is a huge issue. And I don't need to go into it. The book does talk a good bit about that. Talks about the kind of the genesis of the Section 301 tariffs that really raised the tariffs on China and the rest, and why those were put into place and what it meant and how they were kind of justified and rejustified and rejiggered to basically to kind of lead in the same direction. China also shows up more and more in other ways, indirectly. So, it showed up in, for example, the renegotiated NAFTA agreement with a provision that required Mexico and Canada to notify the United States if they began to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. The point of that was to say, well, it's a back door, right? It's a back door for products to get out of China through another country into the United States. So trying to shut off all these doors becomes very, very complicated. And I just use that as one example. There's so many where China is pulled in one way or another. So absolutely, it's a huge part of the picture here. And you're right, it is a huge economy, and its impact on the US has been really enormous in terms of hollowing out. I think the estimates of jobs have been in the millions of jobs that were lost really due to what was called the China shock. But we have very low unemployment now, and you can argue as to whether or not, what that shock really meant. And the security alliance with Japan during that time, I think, was a bedrock, of course. But also, this bipartisan consensus was still very much intact. It was the idea that we have to deal with this other thing that we don't understand, and we feel like it's breaking the rules, even though there's not a rule for it, basically. And really kind of aggressively going after that because of the export deluge and the same sort of impact on communities and on jobs in the United States. So that is very similar, but this consensus stayed intact, basically, even through all of that. Took it out on Japan, negotiated a lot of agreements with Japan, but really kept that consensus to keep this lane open for continuing to liberalize trade. And so the WTO was created after that, a lot of other free trade agreements and the rest of the system continued, basically. So it is a fundamental shift, but it's not, as I argue, just about China, because there's so many other reasons and justifications for it. Just two things you said I want to just address, because I've heard this a lot, and I was in USTR and know very well what actually happened. Depends on how you call it. With the United States, at least, I would say at least within USTR, we were very, very careful not to pressure Japan to get into TPP, period. It was Japan's decision. We gave a lot of information. We shared some ideas. We talked a lot about it. Japan had a challenge in getting in, but it was not because the US pressured Japan to get in. Same with IPEF. The US didn't pressure Japan on IPEF either. In fact, Japan was kind of skeptical for a long time, finally came around as others came around, basically. So the Bambi and Goliath is applicable, but sometimes it feels a little reversed, at least in terms of my career.
No, that's fair. It's the way the Japanese media portray
exactly
negotiation.
Right.
Very fair. We'll start from the back. And you have to leave.
Thanks, Michael. Very important and interesting talk. I was curious about, you told us sort of about your causal story. You told us about the connection with polarization. It seems sort of an ideational take, that sort of the ideas that have come out of the domestic political quagmire that we found ourselves in the last 10 to 15 years has sort of now been extrapolated into people's views on foreign trade relations. The more standard story is a political economy one. And in fact, the most prominent of these is about sectoral competition. Jeff Friedman has a seminal article about the 1930s and the switch, as your metaphor of changing lanes, how we got into the free trade lane in the first place. Friedman shows that there's a shift in the underlying sectoral coalitions that gave rise to a preference for free trade. And I've seen many analyses that have talked about the reverse shift, right? That there's a new sectoral coalition that's now very protectionist. And a lot of that has to do with, rather than security competition with China, about loss of jobs to China and as well as to automation. And that's changed many sectors that had been more competitive, workers who had been benefiting from globalization and therefore supporting free trade in terms of their political preferences, to being much more protectionist now with the changes in the global political economy. That was notably absent in your talk, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, I think in a way, really, I'm saying it's a very similar thing, but in a different way. When I talk about this, you talk about the concern about jobs and how, right? And I do focus on this in the book, and how, the three, blue wall states and those falling really was a huge transformation, and it kind of enabled the horse to be let out of the barn, if you will, and all this stuff. All of that was important and influential. But this concern really was very much shared on this new right side, the Tea Party into the new right, and then the progressive left, which had really been focused on it for decades. So that was really that same sort of coalition coming together with similar concerns, this idea that trade is more harmful than it is a focus of opportunity for the United States, and that it's time to call it all off, basically. So I think I'm kind of saying the same thing, just in a different way. Yep.
Hi. It's been my observation that much of the opposition to free trade and globalization in the United States comes from the unbalanced approach the federal government took. It promoted globalization, free trade agreements, but then did not do a good job of backfilling for our current industries, either by retraining people or making sure there were incentives from the government for new manufacturing and new service industries to be located in those, the Rust Belt, for example. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, in fact, very early, the first page or two of my book, I refer to Edward Alden's book on this particular topic, because what I argue is he's done such a great job of covering that issue that I don't really touch on it in my book. That go see that. I'm going to talk about the trade politics, but in terms of the importance of the impact of that and the lack of everything you just mentioned, lack of foresight and political battles over that as well that kind of hindered it. Yeah, I think it's a hugely important to how this sectoral competition that was just described got to the point that it did, the sense that there was no way out other than just to stop it, basically. And that was certainly felt by a large number of Americans. Yeah. Hey, Don.
Dan Snyder from East Asian Studies. Terrific presentation, and it's hard to argue with the sort of transition that the walking out process that you described. But I'm still curious as to, given that deterioration of free trade, shouldn't we have seen that reflected in the numbers in terms of the scope of expansion of trade, as well as even in economic growth terms? Maybe we have, and I'm not aware of it, but my sense is that sort of the combination of multinational corporations finding ways to around, if you will, the barriers that have been put up, have actually succeeded in some ways in dampening the actual economic effect of walking out. But again, maybe I'm just ignorant of what the reality is.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, it's a very complicated picture, as you point out. I think that trade generally has leveled off, at least in terms of U.S. exports. It really did increase quite a lot under the Obama administration, early in the Trump administration, and then of course the tariffs hit, and you get what you see from that. As to who it benefits and who it doesn't benefit, it's really hard I mean, this is more of a personal experience and feeling that people generally have about it. But as I say, the public generally tends to support it in a general sense. I think that the role of multinational corporations, I mean, I think it's easy. Actually, multinational corporations, and I talk about this in my book as well, are polling at the very bottom of institutions you trust. Basically, I think only Congress polls a little bit worse, but multinational corporations are way down there, basically. I understand the reasons why, but the other challenge is you're also asking multinational corporations to be successful in a globalized world, right? And so they're doing what they need to do to be successful. So I think there's a lot to be said for domestic policy in shifts. There is space for industrial policy, I believe, a certain kind of industrial policy, not exactly necessarily what we're seeing now, to begin to do some of that, to lure and attract companies back. I don't think the only agenda that needs to be in place is an agenda that the traditional Republican Party used, which was deregulation or that kind of thing. That's a part of the story, but there are other incentives that could be put into place. So that complicated picture is really a part of this whole story, right? But it's easy to lump multinationals, I think, in with them in order to blame them. And actually, Biden, when he ran for president 4 years ago, used that very specific tactic to kind of defend his own past record on trade, to say, well, trade wasn't bad, but they took it off course, right? It was their fault, essentially. So that is also entered in, that dynamic is entered into this discussion as well. So yeah, multinationals get hit from all sides these days. And I'm not necessarily a fan of multinationals, but I think it's easy to understand what their interests are, at least. Yeah, positive. Yeah, no, they can have, they can help and move around. But I think it's interesting that as much as you made this point, it's really seen negatively so much in the United States now, right? Yes.
If you had the power to set US trade policy with respect to China, what would be your vision? And specifically, how would you deal with the fact that China signs international agreements, they are part of the WTO, but they don't play by the rules? For instance, there are lots of barriers, such as rules about local ownerships of companies, or a lot of barriers for financial services in China. So what would be your policy to address all these obstacles?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, with China, there is, I think, a justification for going outside the lines sometimes on some of this stuff to make that point. And Lighthizer was very focused on the leverage that tariffs brought. It did. It worked with China. They attempted kind of a soft sort of dialogue kind of approach very early in the Trump administration. And the ending of that was described as old wine in new bottles in terms of commitments, basically. Then the tariffs came along, and then the whole playing field changed. But I think this is what you're also beginning to see now in terms of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign on tariffs, which is this sense that even if you negotiate with China, which is getting to your point, it's still not going to get you very far, basically. They're still going to do what they want to do, right? And that's a completely different kind of problem to deal with than most other countries. So my advice would be, yeah, let's be smart about China. Like, does it necessarily, we don't need large rounded off, $50 billion, $100 billion tariffs thing. That's a feeling and an emotion and a statement. We need a smarter policy in targeting those things that we really feel are, in our deepest national interest and of national concern, basically. Maybe it makes sense to continue to import, plastic laundry bags from China because maybe we don't want to make those. So do we need to be putting tariffs on that? I don't know. I mean, there's an argument here, basically. But my other kind of appeal would be, if we're going to deal with China differently, let's stop dealing with the rest of the world in the same way. We have the tools, we have the Godzilla, we have all those things available. The system is still functioning, is still there. And you have to, it's just, you be aggressive or less aggressive, but there's still ways to resolve these problems and to deal with these concerns rather than to kind of go all Godzilla, basically. Yeah, that's the point I was really trying to make. So thanks for helping me bring that out. Hi.
At the end, toward the end of your talk, excellent talk. Thank you so much. Very stimulating. Perhaps in my case, too stimulating, because I'm going to pose a question that involves a little bit of political science fiction. Toward the end of your talk, you briefly referenced the possibility of a crisis. And if I didn't misunderstand your use of that idea, it was a constructive crisis. I mean, after all, in a way, the system that is deteriorating came out of a massive global crisis called World War II. Now, I'm not advocating World War III in order to correct the trade situation. Obviously not. But I'm challenging you to construct a scenario of optimal conflict. We have regional war in the Middle East. The Red Sea, right? The Houthis are blocking trade in a sense. I mean, it's much riskier now than it was before. One can construct some sort of, it's difficult to say this, and maybe this is a contradiction in terms, and maybe I'm completely wrong, too much fiction, not enough science. But in East Asia, right, with the South China Sea, think of the trade that goes through the South China Sea, for example, not to mention the Taiwan problem. So would you be willing to construct a scenario of optimal conflict that would essentially persuade many of the leaders, maybe not all of them, around the world, not just in the United States, that this is not a zero-sum situation, that it's a plus-minus situation, and there's now minus all around. And we share, therefore, a common commitment in making sure that the trade connections are are fully reopened and that there's some kind of, allocative justice, if I can put it that way.
Sure,
Yeah. Making this up.
no, that's quite a challenge. Optimal is kind of a hard word to use, but I think best case scenario, maybe, potentially, given that the scenario is really going in this, toward the wall, basically, at the moment. I think it kind of goes back to the last question, which is there's something, and actually I saw this myself. I dealt with China and APEC. China tends to be its own worst enemy sometimes, particularly in the room. And if China begins to take actions that really, really isolate it in the region, there is an opportunity to kind of focus this attention on trade and dealing with these problems in a more collaborative fashion in that one direction, and that would kind of reaffirm the importance of some of these principles that have come heretofore. Basically, I'm not saying it's necessarily the ideal, and U.S.-China already in a trade war, and escalating that could really have major other consequences pretty quickly. And that's why when I started writing this book, I began to see this. This is in the beginning of last year. I think now and more you see more and more in the media talking about the 20s and the 30s and the return, be it World War III or be it tariffs or whatever it is. Basically, this is really serious stuff. So kind of promoting escalation is not my goal here, but in order to kind of see the way in which you come back to something that meant and had reason and value and importance and was justified for many good reasons, maybe that may be the way in which it becomes clear to policymakers and easier to politically justify, maybe.
So you mentioned great power politics, and in the framework of great power politics, the rise of like a regional hegemon like China is a threat to the U.S. So would you say that these more free trade agreements that you're talking about, or like the rules-based international agreements that you're talking about, would actually go against what our military assessment of the region would be? For example, like specifically in the great power politics framework, like are those military interests and the economic interests, are those potentially going against each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of, China's still doing trade agreements. We're not doing them. China's still doing them. So China is kind of still connecting and projecting its model and its system out in the world with those countries that want to, see economic value or benefit or feel intimidated or whatever it is, basically to need to engage in that. So, the larger that spreads and the more we sit on the bench, that's where I see the biggest conflict coming up, basically. Foreign policy people are really concerned about this, and they try to use this justification to get TPP passed, for example, in the United States. It was already, as I described in the book, it was already sunk for other reasons, at least in my view, anyway. But the idea of kind of surrounding China and whatever, well, China's doing that now. It's kind of surrounding, the United States with other trade deals with other nations. That's kind of reaching its limits. I think the EU has really pulled back. They were really entertaining such a trade agreement and really pulled back. Australia has had a lot of conflict with China, New Zealand even, and others. So it's a complicated answer, but I think it's really kind of that conflict, that tension, that concern really is in the direction of how the United States, by sitting on the bench, is going to get out, help lead others out of this world of being influenced by China and being a growing trading partner with China and more dependent on it, basically. Sure.
Do you think this maintaining this a better agreement with China is going to help prevent a war in Taiwan?
A better agreement, you mean in terms of trade? Oh, I see. Well, I mean, there's rules based in the South China Sea, which is a different kind of rules based, and that's a whole different, animal. And I think we all can see what's going on there. I mean, I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to really strike a grand bargain with China. It's going to have to come in the context of a broader regional or multilateral sort of context on trade, basically. Until there's pressure to get China to agree to certain approaches and principles, I don't see that as a ticket to preventing an escalation or a war, even with that kind of agreement. It may settle it may help make it harder for China to pursue that kind of action. but I don't think it takes it off the table. No. Economics doesn't always win, mostly, but not always.
Here we go. Okay. Thanks so much for being here. Definitely a great opportunity to learn more about something I'm trying to study now in my program. And I think I want to go back to the question about what you think about US-China trade policy. And you hinted at it a couple of times about how you wouldn't be totally hands-off free trade, but you would welcome some restrictions or some more aggressive stances on the US-China trade relations. And I'm just wondering, could you be a little bit more specific about what you would like to see? Especially, I was wondering what worries you the most. Is it this talk about the trade deficit? Is it talk about unfair subsidies? Is it talk about maybe how security concerns are related to vulnerabilities in supply chains? What is it that worries you the most, and what would you like? Where would you like to see a more aggressive stance? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I can say is that Washington is thinking about this every day, basically. So they're already doing this work for me and for you and for others. And I think a lot of proposals have come out with a lot of different intentions and goals and justifications. I think the United States would do a little bit better to pick and choose what it's really most concerned about. That's a very complicated question. But there is certainly a fever and environment in Washington where anything that involves China, where China may benefit, to try and stand in the way of that and deconstruct that or pull away from it or whatever. That's a legislative approach to the problem, written paper. It's not a policy approach to the problem, basically. So I think some of the things they're doing are fine and right. I think the election will determine, kind of how more aggressive or less aggressive that's going to be. Obviously, technology theft is a huge concern of mine, and dealing with that is an enormous problem. It's more than just IP theft now. This is wholesale. This is a whole different kind of construction. But you have to also expect that China is going to do this in return, right? And so all these decisions are very difficult, and they have to be made with a great deal of care. But ideally, they'd be made in a way that other countries would at least accept or get behind and support. And you begin to see a little bit of mimicking of some of what the United States is doing. And Canada now is doing some of this. The EU is doing some of this as well, vis-a-vis China. Tariffs are one answer in certain cases. They're not the only answer, but they are for certain people. No, I have other worries, but I think that would be, there's subsidization basically that, kind of the model really that's taking place in China is, local governments and the central government have been subsidizing industries to really get ahead and compete. What that's done is led to this huge overcapacity, right? And this dumping of exports everywhere else in the world. That is a huge problem as well. This is a little bit like what Japan did actually for a period of time. Back in the 70s and 80s. And it has huge effects on international markets. And it's a little, it's not gonna work for China just to say, well, we're abiding by the rules. Well, I can go into that a lot because it's not in many ways. But with that, I'll maybe just leave it there. Sure. Okay.
Hi, okay. My understanding is that WTO was not able to produce any meaningful results during the past 20 years through its ministerial meetings, especially in dealing with newly emerging issues like environment, labor standards, intellectual property rights, facilitating trade and service. And considering this 2 decades of stalemate, it feels to me a little that it was sort of expected that United States or even EU sort of walking out or even pulling away from the WTO regime in search for an alternative trading order that deals with these emerging issues. So the question is, I'm wondering why is these alternative trading orders, say IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, has not been working out when it directly seeks to deal with issues of China, issues of intellectual property rights, and so on.
Right. Yeah, the WTO has really struggled, and there's been a couple of things that it's been able to accomplish, but you're generally correct. I think that yeah, how to fold, how to come up with this, what I call in the book, a new model for trade, right? So if the TPP isn't it, or whatever isn't it, like what is it basically? And I talk about how we negotiated an agreement with, renegotiated an agreement with Korea, and it had certain goals and how those were, some were met and some were not met. Talk about the negotiation with Japan and how we had kind of a much bigger agenda and that became a very small agenda and why that was. It's been a messy kind of process. IPEF actually, isn't really focused on intellectual property. It's really, I think the reason it hasn't really gelled and concealed is because it's really a series of US domestic priorities that have been handpicked. And I was there to see this part, handpicked, thrown into this idea of having, hey, let's do a trade agreement, and then sort of presenting itself to the world and inviting people to come in, basically. To be fair, a lot of countries in the region really do want to see the US involved because they want at least this counterbalance minimally. And so a lot of countries did sign up, they participated in the negotiations. They finally got started, it took about a year. Last November in San Francisco, there was an effort to kind of close them on a kind of handshake basis, basically, not perfectly, but handshake basis. And guess who brought that show to a halt? Washington. They were negotiating day and night to get to this point, and it was labor concerns expressed by a couple of US senators to the White House, phone call to San Francisco, gonna shut it down, right? Shut it down, they shut it down. So technically those negotiations are still ongoing, but nothing really has happened for a year. And that's because of this concern, this political concern that's going to be used as a weapon. It's a concern that the labor unions would oppose it and come out against, and it would be a political issue. So the US is stepping in its own way. This was the US initiative that the US took off the rails, basically. So, and also it's kind of a vision that other countries haven't really fully signed on to, I think it's fair to say.
Thanks so much for the presentation on your book. I have a question to kind of about the China angle, but looking at it a little bit more abstractly. So that is, I believe that if there were going to be any hope of kind of resurrecting and re-injecting energy into the multilateral trading system, there'd have to be a effective mechanism in place to discipline free riders on the multilateral system, as well as to prevent disruptors from becoming a part of it. And as we look at China and some of the areas where its economy isn't really compatible with a free market-based international trading system, I was reflecting back on the fact that obviously during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact states weren't part of the GATT, and as we're potentially faced what some people are calling like a bifurcation of economies, either centered around China or the United States, I think there could be some questions about not just China's participation in a potentially resurrected multilateral trading system, but even other countries as well. So, potential incompatible behaviors, some people might say subsidies or anti-dumping, but that's things that European countries do as well, and that the U.S. has been accused of doing too. But there's deeper issues like potential for military conflict, or other countries having established national level policies themselves to compete with or disagree with American policies. Obviously, theft of not just trade secrets, but data on Americans, serious domestic human rights abuses. I'm just raising all those areas of incompatibility to ask, like, which ones of these are really key? if there were going to be like a new multilateral trading system, we could say, oh, if country X is doing these things, then they just can't be a part.
Yeah, that would be very, I'm actually kind of intrigued by the idea of an alternative WTO as maybe a way out of this, maybe sort of a way of blowing up things in order to get to something else. That's another possibility. But yeah, I mean, as someone who sat in a room and negotiated trade agreements with a number of countries and heard positions of a number of countries, it's going to be very difficult to do anything other than what came before in terms of the fundamental basic principles. If the future of the world, the future of the trading system were at risk, maybe you would get a kind of a crisis moment that might create more flexibility, if you will. But you're going to get the same kind of tensions between developing countries and developed countries. You're going to get the same EU-US tensions. You're going to get the same, you know, even those you think are your friends or you find gets very complicated very quickly. So I think any agreement like that is going to necessarily sort of look a lot like the agreement that came in the past, but it would mean the US having to recommit to it with certain members left out, basically. I think there is a role to add new elements if it's possible. Obviously, you know, certainly I think to satisfy domestic concerns here, you know, adding some degree of labor provisions to these agreements. But, you know, every time we've tried to add labor provisions to an agreement, we've basically, labor unions here have objected and said that it's not enough, and they kill the agreement. That happened with IPAF, it happened with TPP. It's just kind of a consistent, you know, sort of, and it almost happened with NAFTA that became USMCA, but that was just a renegotiation, not a sort of a new one. So I think, yeah, very difficult slogging to get to that point. But really the agenda is probably more one of who are you not inviting?
Right. Thank you very much, Mike, for a great book talk. It's very balanced and thoughtful. My question is very brief. So it's also related to RPEF. If Trump got re-elected, how do you think what will happen to RPEF?
It's gone. I mean, it was never signed, so nothing happens. We just don't meet anymore. You may make some sort of statement, we're not going to do that anymore, but that would be about it. That'd be all that would have to happen. Yeah. I mean, there are, to be a little more nuanced, there are 4 parts of IPAF. So what I'm talking about is the trade part of IPAF. There are 3 other agreements, so supply chain and energy, and I don't know what would happen to those. They're pretty soft and were not the focus kind of Trump's trade attention. So those might survive in some fashion. Hard to say, but certainly the trade pillar, the trade part of IPAF would just evaporate overnight. Yeah. I mean, some have argued that it kind of already has.
One last question, maybe? Quick question.
I actually want to go back to the thing we were talking about with China policy, because I feel like, could you actually be like more concrete? So like when you say that there are you have some tribulations with, for example, intellectual property theft or rights, or that type of issue, or tech theft, what exactly would you do in terms of the trade policy, in terms of the negotiations to make sure that doesn't happen while maintaining the same rules-based agreements that you want to have, right? So I don't know if my question makes sense, but.
It does, yeah. I mean, negotiating rules is very hard, and there's a reason why the rules are a little soft. Is because countries have their own domestic reasons for not spelling everything out and leaving exceptions and leaving room for flexibilities and leaving whatever. So the kind of agreement you would have to reach with China, I think, would be the kind of agreement where China is unilaterally committing to this and this and this and this and this in very specific terms. Because I think, you know, US argument would be that we don't need to agree to that because that's our system basically already. Because if you try and negotiate mutual commitments that both are agreeing to, I think it'd be very difficult to reach that kind of agreement that would actually be meaningful. China would just find its way through a bunch of holes in the agreement basically to do as it wished. So I think it's that, but I don't think something like tech theft or whatever is going to be, you can get commitments from China, but I don't think it's going to be solved through an agreement. It's a shift, and it's a political decision more than it is a negotiation, I think. And whether you can leverage that on a country like China, because the kind of agreement you would need to negotiate would be really difficult to put in words what exactly would have to happen to make this okay with you. Yeah. Trade agreements are hard.
Great. Now, if this talk makes you worry about America's reputation in the world, there's another talk coming up tomorrow at noon in the same room with lunch served by Yusa Horiuchi of Dartmouth College, talking about, he's looking at the impact of democratic backsliding in the US on America's image in the Asia Pacific. So please join us for that one as well. And please pick it up and use the discount code to purchase his Dr. Michael Beeman's book. So, and please join me in thanking Michael for the wonderful lecture and Q&A. Thank you.